just now joining us, my name is Patrick, and I will be sharing with you our insights and learnings on today's topic for this We Robotics webinar. There's been a lot of interest, to say the least, on this particular topic. We've received over 500 RSVPs and well over 200 questions as well. So thank you very much for your interest, as well as all your questions. They're very informative and of course have been very helpful in setting up this particular webinar and the focus of this webinar as well. This webinar is actually part of our series on the COVID response. And so to learn more about our policies, strategies, and operations in response to the pandemic, we invite you to check out werobotics.org/COVID. A few quick words about We Robotics to provide you with some context for today's webinar presentation. We Robotics is a local first organization. This means we shift power to local experts by working with them to expand their expertise and their opportunities based on their priorities. And we believe that local leadership is more important for positive social change than any techno-centric solution, which is why we have developed a model called the Flying Labs model to shift power to local leaders. And this explains why local experts across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are using this Flying Labs model to co-create their own independent knowledge hubs. These hubs, known as Flying Labs, are led entirely by local experts who we train, equip, and support as needed. And increasingly, the Flying Labs train other Flying Labs, and they also increasingly team up on joint projects. In addition, Flying Labs are also directly connected to government, including civil aviation authorities, industry, as well as civil society in their respective countries. Today, Flying Labs are operational in over 25 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Flying Labs network is thus a diverse network of local entrepreneurs, engineers, and scientists. Together, they demonstrate the power of local knowledge and local leadership in tackling local problems. So our role as We Robotics in the Flying Labs network is to help facilitate knowledge exchange, the latest lessons learned and best practices. We also facilitate technology transfer and help create new opportunities for local experts. And we do this through our 4 sector programs, which are directly tied to the Sustainable Development Goals. Our humanitarian program, for example, enables Flying Labs to deploy more effectively during humanitarian disasters, both large and small. Our health program enables Flying Labs to run their own cargo drone projects to deliver essential medicines and to collect patient samples. Our environmental program enables Flying Labs to work more effectively on climate change adaptation, agriculture, and nature conservation. Last but not least, our development program enables these labs to work more effectively on urban planning, property rights, and sustainable development projects. Ultimately, our goal is to enable systems change. We want to shift the power to local experts across all sectors. And as a first step, we are co-creating these individual Flying Labs with local experts, as just shown, and co-creating the network of Flying Labs as well. The next step will be to spin off flyinglabs.org as its own independent organization, deeply rooted in the Global South and led entirely, of course, by leaders from the Global South. And as a final step, with this experience, We Robotics will help to transform other foreign-first organizations into local-first organizations. Now, before I jump to the main topic of today's webinar presentation, I do want to pause, which is why you'll see the screen is blank on purpose here. And the reason for that is because I find that, and this has been true in past 15 years of work that I've done in the humanitarian technology space, that it's easy to get into the technical debates about which technology works and how and when and what doesn't work and what's nonsense. And we can really get into the weeds. And in the process, sometimes we kind of lose sight of why we're doing this in the first place. Fact of the matter is, the pandemic is a global emergency, and it's having it's just an understatement to say that it's been having and continues to have a significant impact on human lives. A tremendous amount of suffering, human suffering that many are witnessing right now. We know that lives are being ripped apart. We know that families are being ripped apart. Where we know that communities are being ripped apart. Businesses and so on. There's a lot of human suffering, and that's just probably the biggest understatement of the year. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that, because ultimately that human suffering is why we're here. It's why we're trying to use the limited time, the precious time that we have and the resources we have to try and make a difference. So as we get into the technical details and the use cases and the applications, let's remind ourselves that we're doing that ultimately because our shared goal is to help reduce human suffering as best as we can. So thank you for letting me just pause and share that. That is ultimately why we're here. Okay, let's get this discussion started then. We'll first go into some of these different applications and share with you the insights that we have gained over the past several weeks and months, the evidence that we've been able to collect, and then more importantly, we're looking forward to your questions, observations, comments, you name it. So please do feel free to make use of the chat to share those questions, and then my good colleague Kaya and I will be sure to go through these questions during the open Q&A. I want to start off by sharing this tweet that just really resonated for me. I don't know if any of you already saw Evan Greer's tweet from just a few days ago. It really summarizes, I think, some of the challenges that we're seeing, right? So she goes, right, we hear medical experts saying we need testing, protection, social distancing, and so on. And then the response we're getting is, from tech bros, okay, so you need surveillance, right? Medical experts come back and say, no, actually we need testing, hand washing, masks, and we need people to stay at home. Tech bros come back and say, oh, okay, so fever-seeking drones, that's what we need, huh? Medical experts starting to get exasperated, no, we need testing and protective equipment. And tech bros come back and say, oh, okay, facial recognition, right? And I share Evan's frustration there, because it's true of all humanitarian disasters that we worked in, and we're seeing it again, where people are leading with the technology rather than with the actual problems. Now, Drone Industry Insights shared a helpful diagram of some of the applications that we are seeing being promoted and used in response to the pandemic. Now, on the right-hand side, you see a list of applications that are under the title of delivering essential goods and services. These use cases are very mature use cases. They've been used for years before anybody had heard of the coronavirus. And so, of course, it stands to reason that the application of drones in these specific use cases will most likely be meaningful, right? Because they were already proven in many respects before the pandemic. In contrast, on the left-hand side, we're seeing a host of other applications that are somewhat more novel in battling the spread of the virus. And it's really these applications and related applications that warrant a bit more critical analysis, not just for the sake of criticizing. I tend to be, usually enthusiastic about new applications of humanitarian technology. But again, there's a finite time, limited resources for most of us. So let's use the precious time we do have and the limited resources available to actually have the impact. And so what I want to do for the bulk of this webinar is just go through some of these different applications and share with you what our honest thoughts are with respect to the impact or lack thereof of these applications. So we'll start with spraying or fumigating, and in particular outdoor spraying of public spaces using aerial drones. So what's the deal there? Well, let's not beat around the bush. If we look at what the Lancet Journal has to say on this, they specifically refer to the use of aerial spraying in response to the coronavirus as something that needs to be stopped, has no value, is in fact potentially harmful, and should therefore be avoided. They're not mincing their words here. Other scientific journals have basically confirmed the same. And yet we are still seeing, as of still today, as recently as today, let alone 3 months ago, a number of governments and drone companies not only promoting the use of drones for aerial spraying of disinfectants, but are actually still now today launching new interventions using drones for aerial spraying. And that's obviously quite problematic. Being somebody who has asthma, that can have a significant impact on people who have already respiratory difficulties, in part, for example, by suffering from asthma. That's actually not good for those folks. Now, I don't know if it's really a counter argument, but there is another coexisting argument that needs to be acknowledged and not discounted. We all know that. Well, let me backtrack. In speaking with some of these drone pilots and organizations that have been involved during the early days in doing this aerial spraying, I've shared with them very politely and diplomatically and genuinely, whether the evidence is there to kind of support that this would have an impact on reducing the transmission of COVID-19. And while, in fact, a number of them acknowledge that indeed they don't know that there really is any evidence to show that this would have a meaningful impact, a number of them did say, however, that the use of this technology in this kind of way can help reassure local communities, reassure the communities that something is happening, that the government is being responsive, that there is hope, there is something that we can do. And of course, reassurance and psychological well-being are incredibly important drivers of resilience, human resilience, community resilience, and so on. So that needs to be acknowledged. That's also, well proven. I think at the same time, what we have to figure out is whether there are other applications and interventions, regardless of whether they use drones or not, that can perhaps better serve to provide this kind of reassurance and psychological support to at-risk communities around the world. Another popular application that police departments around the world and drone companies are promoting quite actively is this idea of using drones for remote, temperature scanning and even cough detection, as well as automatically detecting sneezes. So here again, what's the deal with that? Well, for something like that to be effective, reasonably effective, you have to be very close to the drone itself. Some are saying, ideally no less than 0.8 meters. Now, if you've worked with drones or been near to a drone, you'll know that the last place you want to be at eye level is with those rotating propellers, right? Drones are flying blenders, plain and simple. Being that close to a drone is not advisable, and that's an understatement. And not only that, but physical distancing measures by the WHO and other ministries of health suggest that we should keep 2 meters distance. So that's problematic in itself. But more problematic is how uncritical and gullible the media has been with respect to some of these press releases coming out of drone companies. I mean, there is literally false advertising. There's one company that got caught red-handed where they've shown they've actually modified certain images. They've doctored the evidence, if you'd like, to claim and show that their sensors are actually working, and they're charging $8,000+ for these sensors that actually don't work. Another company has partnered with a university claiming to be able to do this kind of remote scanning at 58 meters distance, which if you look at the current research, applied research, is basically impossible. So I would go so far as to suggest that this is frankly a hoax. Because if you do look at the applied research that's been taking place, based on which this technology is supposedly been developed from, those experiments have happened indoors with individuals who are not moving, so stationary subjects with lighting that doesn't change. So a very, very controlled indoor environment at 3 to 8 meters. When you take robotics out of the lab and into the wild, having worked in this space for several years, it's a whole other ballgame, and it's kind of astounding how many police departments, governments, donors, and others are falling prey to the scam. It's not temperature scanning; it's temperature scanning. Of course, even if it were to be possible, even if there was some kind of incredible breakthrough in the next few months, I mean, it's also incredibly intrusive and raises some serious privacy concerns as well. And like any technology application, whether it's for the pandemic or after a hurricane, flooding, earthquake, you name it, what are the alternative solutions? Temperature measurement is not new because drones have all of a sudden become available, right? Medical thermometers exist. They don't just all of a sudden become devoid of value because we have flying blenders. So always important to determine like what else is already being used, can be optimized before we start, hyping up other kind of solutions. Another interesting application is the use of speakers on drones. We've also, so some new drones have actually integrated speakers that can record, that can play out recorded announcements or actually provide real-time announcements. Others we've seen are using drones and literally fixing, megaphones on the bottom of these drones in order to do a kind of public broadcasting, public messaging to let folks know that they should remember to keep physical distance, stay in their homes, observe the lockdown measures, and so on. So in that particular use case, what we're seeing is actually a mix of promising success and positive impact of this new application, but we're also seeing some cases where, in fact, that use of the drone is not necessarily having the intended impact, let alone any impact. In some cases, like in Brazil and in Rwanda, we've seen footage where these broadcasting drones go out in public areas and actually piques people's interest. I mean, people hear the announcements, they hear the drone, they see it fly, and they want to learn more. If that were happening outside my window here in Switzerland, I'd be doing the same. I'd want to investigate. And so, of course, in that case, the intention is actually then not actually working out, because you're having the opposite reaction in terms of behavioral change. You're not having people disperse or stay home or change their behavior in order to be safer. They're actually congregating in crowds. So much so that in the case of Rwanda, the National Rwandan Police that are using these broadcasting drones, as part of their announcements now, are having to tell people, stay home. If you hear this drone, if you hear this announcement, stay home, don't come outside and congregate in a crowd. Please stay home and observe the lockdown. So, interesting. But then again, I don't want to suggest that it's always like that. We are seeing some promising results in certain cases. And so that begs the question, why does it work in some cases and why not in others? In some respects, this has to do with different social, economic, cultural, political, and historical factors. So we have to better understand which of these factors enable this particular application to be more impactful, more positive than others, and then how to optimize around that. I think one point that gets lost in a lot of this, in doing the applied research and speaking with many groups that are involved in this application, is they're just repeating what people have already heard 100 times, whether they've heard it via radio or on television or online. Wash your hands, stay 2 meters distance, stay home. They've heard that 100 times over. So if they've already heard that 100 times over, and yet they're still out and about and congregating and so on, obviously, repeating the same message may not actually lead to a different outcome. And so if you look at, the marketing and the advertising industry, obviously there are pros at being able to craft messaging in order to create specific types of behavior change, like purchasing more of X or what have you. So what can we learn from this kind of messaging and the strategies used by the advertising industry to craft more impactful messages? Is it by targeting certain demographics and localizing the messaging? Should the messaging be just for adult men who potentially are breaking the rules more often? Should it be towards children? Should a local celebrity be giving the messages, and so on? That should not be overlooked as an important contributing factor to whether or not this application is impactful or not. So more evidence is needed because, of course, those who are pro using speakers on drones for the COVID response will use the anecdotes that back their interests, and those who are critics and only want to be critics are going to handpick those anecdotes that basically support their arguments. So we just need a lot more data. We need to better understand what the impact is, and that's not easy to do right now. So I also want to acknowledge that it's easier said than done. And again, just because we have broadcasting drones does not mean that there was never public announcements being done before the arrival of drones. For example, giving you something that a good colleague of mine shared from Kigali in Rwanda, who's been hearing some of these drones. He was saying, well, listen, until they were doing these aerial broadcast announcements, they were using these massive speakers on the back of trucks that you could hear for miles and miles and miles. And that was working perfectly fine. In contrast with some of these speaker drones, the speakers themselves are quite directional. So if you found yourself in a certain position vis-a-vis the drone and the speaker, you would have a hard time hearing what that announcement was actually saying, right? So again, it shouldn't be an either. It shouldn't be an either or. Let's first find out what works, and if it's already working, then do we really need to add anything else? Cargo delivery is one of the more let's say justifiable, perhaps, applications. It's definitely based on your responses and the questions that we've received from many of you, an overriding interest in terms of applications in response to the pandemic. So let's look into that a bit more. I think that the first point to note, having worked with Flying Labs on cargo drones for almost half a decade, the ability to rapidly deploy new drone deliveries in a new country or new routes from scratch is really the holy grail, right? that's what we in the humanitarian space are actively exploring as a community of practice, to understand how do we go from setting up medical deliveries that are kind of like routine deliveries to rapid deployment of completely new deliveries after a major shock like a pandemic. And that really is a holy grail. And the reason it's a holy grail is because it can be incredibly time consuming. Just figuring out the logistics in itself can be a huge challenge. And even more so now with the lockdowns, right? Regulations, it can take, in some of the projects we've done, it can take 6 months up to 9 months to secure flight permissions for cargo drone deliveries in some of the countries where we've done medical drone deliveries. And also limited expertise, and this is where the digital divide and inequalities also come in. In many countries around the world, that expertise in terms of cargo drone delivery does not necessarily exist, nor does the availability of affordable, reliable cargo drones either. So you have a bit of a challenge there, because if you have limited expertise and not really access to the technology, then what are you supposed to do? Now, on the regulations question, since there were a number of questions that you shared with respect to regulations, typically what happens after major disasters is that civil aviation authorities will become a lot stricter. They will close down or severely restrict the airspace. And that's understandable. It's not optimal in some cases, but it's also understandable, because you potentially have more air traffic with respect to cargo aircraft coming in, low-flying search and rescue helicopters, and then you have a bunch of disaster tourists who show up and think they're Indiana Jones, who tend to create more harm than any good. What's interesting in the context of the pandemic, obviously this is it's a completely different ballgame, right? It's a global public health emergency. And what we're seeing is, for example, in the US, the FAA is actually relaxing its regulations around the use of drones and deployment of drones, both for mapping, but also for cargo. What one FAA representative mentioned earlier this week was, listen, the air traffic, the commercial air traffic and so on is so reduced that just the risks are a lot less of having any kind of collisions between a drone and an aircraft. So for them, they feel like things are not as risky right now. At the same time, this official has said, but don't get used to it, because as air traffic picks up again, those relaxation of regulations will not remain indefinitely. Just recently, thanks to another colleague, I learned that in Sri Lanka, the Civil Aviation Authority itself is actively reaching out publicly, is crowdsourcing almost. Not almost, in fact, they are crowdsourcing and calling for drone pilots, experienced drone pilots, to lend a hand, to apply their technology, their expertise in support of the COVID response in Sri Lanka, which I found very fascinating, and of course comes with exciting opportunities as well as challenges. What we are finding in the 12 plus countries where we've seen cargo drone deliveries happen in response to COVID is that for the most part, the vast majority of these are done by drone companies that are already in country and that have already been providing a service for a few months or for a couple of years in between. And so, of course, if you already have the technology in country, you already have the drone teams in country, you've already received regulatory permission from aviation authorities to do these deliveries, then ramping up and doing more deliveries per day to meet increasing demand becomes a lot more easier than starting from scratch, and being able to pivot and start delivering other types of medication or protective personal equipment, or even patient samples to help accelerate the testing for COVID. We're seeing that happen. We're seeing that happen in Ghana, in the US, in Australia, and then we're seeing some more hyper-local examples where literally like a mom and pop shop selling sandwiches, is teamed up with a local drone pilot to deliver sandwiches within a 3-mile radius. We're seeing that in a number of countries, the more hyper-local consumer-based approaches to cargo delivery. One point to keep in mind, and this is been true before COVID, and it will remain true for the foreseeable future, is that a lot of the large, drone companies that are involved in this space, specifically in terms of public health, based on their business model, they optimize for very high frequency deliveries, right? So we know, for example, Zipline in Ghana, their drone ports, or they call them fulfillment centers, can reportedly do up to 600 flights a day. And we've heard different versions of this. On average, they provide 500 deliveries per day per drone port. And they have 4 drone ports in Ghana, which is incredibly impressive. Now, the point to keep in mind is Zipline and others are not going to set up a drone port in an area where there's little to no demand. Obviously, right? It's a huge investment setting up these drone ports, getting the tech. They want to be, and they position their drone ports in places where up to 600 deliveries per day are required, which means they're not going to set up a drone port where some 600 deliveries per year are required. That's just not going to work with their business model, which would therefore suggest that some communities that are outside those drone port areas are not going to necessarily benefit from those drone delivery services. And so what we've seen before, and we may see again, is these remote, hard to reach communities, again, being overlooked because the profit margins are not there. Now, we know that even before drones, the most hard to reach communities are the more expensive communities to reach. And one could argue potentially that, the fact that they're so remote makes them potentially much safer with respect to the pandemic than more urban areas. Unfortunately, that is completely wrong. We've already seen some very remote indigenous communities in Brazil and other countries starting to get ravaged by the coronavirus, right? So what do we do as a community to ensure that these kinds of services are provided to those who potentially even need it the most and are most at risk? And of course, supply chain is not new because drones entered the picture. Motorbikes, bicycles, walking, we've seen all these applications. They are still really, really important in reaching remote communities. So it's obviously not necessarily an either or, but I can tell you from our experience in doing cargo drones for the past 4 years, I would say 9 out of 10 times that a prospective partner comes to us with a need to use cargo drones, it's actually not compelling. You're better off fixing the bridge, using motorbikes, or another solution than using cargo drones. Okay, if you are interested in the application of cargo drones, I would like to invite you to check out our recent blog post on that particular topic, where we are documenting how these delivery drones are being used across some 12 plus countries, and we're updating this blog post on a daily basis, and you'll find it at werobotics.org/COVID. Also, if you're interested in delving in a bit more deeply into this space, we have a professional peer-reviewed online training on the use of medical cargo drones in public health. It is the only course of its kind. We've taught it both offline and online. A number of colleagues from the World Health Organization and other humanitarian and public health organizations, as well as ministries of health, have successfully completed this training and have ranked it 5 stars out of 5. So we welcome you to join us for that training as well, should you want to learn more about this space. So let's move on, and then I'll close up in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so we can get to the questions. Surveillance obviously is not a new application of drone technology. In fact, drones were created in the first place to create situational awareness, right? That was the main use case. And here again, we're seeing a mix. In some cases, it looks like it's having promising impact. And in other cases, it doesn't look that promising. Either, it seems to have little to no impact, or potentially, in some cases, may actually inadvertently increase fear and anxiety and stress as well. Now, again, the difference between these different applications and this application and whether or not it's positive, it has its positive impact that's as intended or not, is again, most likely due to different social, economic, cultural, political, historical factors. And that's where we have to do a bit more research to really understand in what context is it appropriate and is it impactful. And of course, we've already seen, and this has already been an issue well before the pandemic, that the use of surveillance drones raises some serious data privacy and data protection concerns. And we're also seeing that in relation to the pandemic, we're seeing a number of governments, frankly, take advantage of this emergency to consolidate their surveillance powers and abilities, leading to what many have described as government overreach. So with that, if you're more interested on topics related to the data privacy, data protection issues, which are incredibly important, I invite you to read our piece on that, again, on werobotics.org/COVID. And we will be running a future webinar on this particular topic, specifically drones, privacy, and COVID. And I should also mention that we will also be organizing a webinar specifically on cargo drones and response to COVID. Okay, moving along, connectivity. Using drones to provide 3G, 4G, LTE, Wi-Fi connectivity is a relatively new application, but we have had a number of conversations already with some partners who are particularly keen on this application, and specifically in the context of refugee camps that don't necessarily have already the kind of conventional communication infrastructure in place to enable local communities to communicate, and to enable humanitarians to also communicate with local communities. So the argument there is, can we roll out these tethered flying cell phone towers in these refugee camps to provide that connectivity and communication, which is essential. Access to information in humanitarian disasters is equally important as access to food, water, shelter, and medication. So we're following this quite intently with a number of our flying labs. It could very well be that in the next month or two, we actually have a deployment of this in collaboration with our partners. So we'll be sure to keep everyone updated on that application. And of course, there are alternative solutions. So again, weigh the pros and cons. Yeah, I can go into more details on that in the Q&A if there's more questions. Mapping as well, obviously, is not a new application for drones. It's included here nevertheless, because there's some interesting, maybe new use cases that we haven't seen before, because we haven't seen a pandemic like this one before. What we're seeing, especially in India, some Indian drone companies have been approached by a number of different police departments across India, and have provided these police departments with high-resolution aerial imagery overlaid with population data. And obviously, population density is obviously a factor in the transmission of the coronavirus. And according to the police that have been interviewed using these maps, it's a very, very positive. They are very grateful to have access to this kind of data. They report that this has allowed them to help set up isolation centers, screening centers, treatment centers in a far more rational way rather than just guesswork. It's also helped to set up just logistical routes, delivery routes for groceries. In Peru, in Lima, being used to create maps of certain parts of Lima to identify then the number of vehicles on the road, the number of umbrellas for outdoor markets, groceries, and so on being sold. And that is, the intention there is to get a sense of the level of lockdown, observation of the lockdowns and the distancing requirements that the Peruvian government has put in place. Now, of course, many other police departments and public safety agencies and so on are not using drones for this. This is true in all countries, the US as well. I was on a webinar yesterday where a number of public safety agencies are saying, no, they're not using drones and they don't intend to use drones, right? So there are alternatives to being able to inform these kinds of decisions in response to public safety and the pandemic. Lastly, a rather curious, maybe a one-off application that we've seen in China, where drones have been carrying these large posters of QR codes. This is just outside of Shenzhen on the exits of highways that lead into Shenzhen. Drivers are asked to use a smartphone to scan the QR codes that enables the government to know where that driver and car is coming from, where were they before driving into Shenzhen, and it's most likely linked to the government's rather expansive use of QR code tracking for the coronavirus that they put in place, already months ago. So it's not unique to the use of drones. Unknown as to how impactful this has been and whether it's in fact that useful, because why not just put a poster by the toll booths where these cars drive off the exits of the highways. So just an interesting other application. In conclusion, and then we'll jump into your questions. So I'm hoping to see that you've shared any comments or observations in the chat that we could then go through. If you are thinking, or if you know companies, organizations, governments that are thinking of using drones in response to the pandemic, I would invite you to share this decision tree, very simple decision tree with them, which you'll find at the same link, werobotics.org/COVID. So if you are thinking of using drones, the first question is, well, have you actually spoken with what I call the problem owners, the ones who have a particular problem that they're trying to tackle, to really understand their need? Have you taken the time to understand really what the problem is, not what you perceive the problem to be or assume the problem to be, but what it actually is? If you haven't had a chance to talk with the problem owners, then that's the first step. Now, if you have, then the question is, well, what other tools are they using right now? And are these tools actually already helpful? Are they actually tackling the problem at hand? And if so, then frankly, get out of the way. They have other things to do. Now, if the tools they're using are not optimal, they're not being as effective, and so therefore the use of drone technology could potentially make their interventions more impactful, then the next question you need to ask yourself is, well, what are the legal frameworks, privacy frameworks, policy frameworks around the use of this technology with respect to the solution you're offering, right? Do you understand the drone regulations, the privacy regulations, public health regulations as well? If you don't have a good understanding of these frameworks, then that should be your next homework, is to really understand what the implications are, because first and foremost, the principle of do no harm is the first priority. Now, if you understand the frameworks and you believe that you can offer a solution that respects these different regulations and policies, then it's not a guarantee that your solution is appropriate and will have impact. It might be a good idea. And in which case, the next step we suggest is that you do a quick pilot project, a quick, one-off, understand, do the proof of concept, and make sure to get feedback from end users themselves, the problem owners that I spoke about earlier, to really understand whether there's something to this. And if there is, then you can iterate, scale, and so on. But if there's not, then obviously you start from scratch again, or just get out of the way. Again, principle of do no harm is paramount. And one question we all need to ask ourselves is, yes, drones help reduce risk, but whose risk, right? By sending a drone rather than a person, that's a police department, if that's a humanitarian organization, if that's a Ministry of Health, by sending a drone rather than a person, are we just transferring the risk from ourselves to those communities that are already at much greater risk than we are? And that's a question that we have to keep front and center at all times. Which brings me to my next slide, which is the Humanitarian UAV Drone Code of Conduct. If you're not familiar with it, please take a few minutes to consult this drone code of conduct. It's been around for 6 years now. It's been developed by dozens and dozens of international humanitarian organizations and other key stakeholders. It's there for a reason. And it is very well respected by the international humanitarian community. Major UN agencies reference it on a regular basis. Big international companies like DJI regularly promote this code of conduct as well. It's there for a reason, to guide best practice and to ensure that we do no harm as a community. So in conclusion, some applications make no sense, and that's potentially the most polite way that I can put it. Some need a bit more information. They're promising, but we need to figure out how to better optimize and have the positive impact with those applications. And just because the new applications are so exciting and shiny and get hyped up and the media goes nuts with these kinds of applications, doesn't mean we should be ignoring mature applications that have been around for years. They're not necessarily as sexy because they're not as new, but they're potentially even more impactful than any of the other more novel applications. Equally importantly, unfortunately, COVID does not have a monopoly on disasters. We've already seen a Category 5 cyclone hit Vanuatu in the South Pacific. We're going to see hurricanes, cyclones, massive flooding, earthquakes, and all kinds of other disasters, wildfires happening potentially at the same time that countries are still facing the steep curve of coronavirus cases. And so while a lot of attention is being placed by donors in governments, companies, organizations on COVID, which of course is understandable, there is at the same time a danger that we just narrow our field of vision to only issues related to COVID and forget the fact that climate change is certainly not going anywhere and is in fact getting worse, not better. So I would encourage others who are not seeing a positive role that they can play right now in response to COVID to please prepare to respond to those adjacent crises that are inevitable and are going to be made worse because they're already going to hit local communities and disaster management organizations that are completely overstretched due to the virus. In terms of long-term opportunities, we do have an opportunity here. We've seen in many countries where people are calling for the use of cargo drones and other types of applications of drones in response to COVID, that it's not possible because the expertise and technology is not there. So we can take the opportunity in the medium to long term to help incubate local businesses, locally owned and locally managed drone businesses that offer drones as a service, whether it's cargo or mapping or otherwise, so that we actually, the next time that this disaster hits, that this can actually be led locally rather than with folks parachuting in from the outside who don't speak the local language, don't understand the local culture, and who are only going to be there as long as the contract lasts. And then finally, related to all this is the digital divide. And it's really important that local leaders have a meaningful opportunity to lead and implement the application of these technologies in their own countries. This is why one of my favorite examples of how drones are being used in response to COVID is here in the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. For years and years and years, my good colleagues at Nepal Flying Labs and its 3 municipalities that form the Kathmandu Valley area have been trying to get flight permissions from the Nepal Civil Aviation Authority in order to create a very high resolution map of Kathmandu that's important for so many different applications, from urban planning to disaster risk reduction, even climate change adaptation, you name it. But for the past 5 years, it's been impossible to get these flight permissions because you have the airport, the international airport of Kathmandu that's literally right around the corner, where the drones literally fly into this valley to land. And so now, because the air traffic is at an all-time low, finally, and I'm glad to share this for the first time here, just as a few days ago, Nepal Flying Labs and partners have successfully secured flight permissions from the Nepali Civil Aviation Authority to carry out the first ever high resolution survey of Kathmandu. And they are now leading with a heck of a lot of community engagement, which has its own challenges, of course, even without a pandemic, but even more so within pandemic, given the lockdown and the physical distancing. So they're taking a number of different strategies, media strategies, radio, newspapers, television, to go through the required community engagement activities and public awareness raising activities that are so essential to any kind of a drone project. So that's it. Thank you very much for your patience. You can find a 6,000-word study on everything that I've just shared online. We're updating the study on a regular basis as well with new information. You'll find the study has over 100 links to other resources and evidence and anecdotes and so on. So feel free to make full use of that and to share your feedback with us, what we're missing, what we may have gotten wrong. We'll correct it right away. It's really important that everything we share is as accurate as possible and as we know. So your help there would be very much welcomed. And let's open it up now to the discussion with all of you. I am around for as long as you would like, for at least another half an hour. So I realize we're getting to the top of the hour. So for those of you who need to drop off, by all means, please do. In the meantime, I'm going to work with my colleague here, Kaya, to look at any questions that you may have already shared. So with that, I'll just go through the list of the first few questions. There's a comment about spraying that I don't quite understand. But just to maybe expand, obviously spraying as an application in agriculture is not new. Côte d'Ivoire Flying Labs in West Africa is one of the leaders in West Africa in the use of drones in agriculture to disinfect crops and so on. I'm not an expert on agriculture, but I know this is an application that has happened in China, in Japan, in many countries here in Switzerland as well. So that is a mature application. And of course, as well, we've seen the use of cargo drones to help reduce malaria in Tanzania. So Tanzania Flying Labs has been partnering with a number of different organizations just as recently as a few months ago, and you'll find more on that in a video on the We Robotics website, where they're using a certain substance that kills the larva, a mosquito larva, in order to reduce the spread of malaria. We've worked on projects in Brazil and in Fiji using cargo drones to reduce the incidence of dengue as well as Zika as well. So there's certainly other applications in terms of the spraying or the use of release systems on drones for public health. Another question we're seeing, a question with respect to the Pacific Islands. Great question. So we've worked across the Pacific, Flying Labs based in Fiji. We've worked in Tonga, in Marshall Islands, in Vanuatu. What's interesting about the Pacific is that, and I think maybe the person who's asking here is maybe already more of an expert than I am, but one of the challenges we face is that some countries like Fiji will request certification, remote pilot licenses from the Australian CAA, whereas in Vanuatu they don't accept Australian CAA CASA certification. They will only accept New Zealand certification. So it can be a bit of a challenge there. But if there are more questions there, we have had many meetings in person with multiple aviation authorities across the Pacific. And so if there are follow-up questions, feel free to follow up via email, and I can put you in touch with the right colleagues from Fiji who can speak with more authority on that. Another question we're seeing here is the importance of access to accurate information in humanitarian disasters. Could broadcasting drones be used to dispel misinformation? If not, do you think that would be a good idea, or on the other hand, unnecessary? That's a really great question. There's actually a project in northern Kenya that's been around for years. I don't know the latest the latest status of the project, but it's led by a group called the Sentinel Project, and they've been using drones in Turkana area in northern Kenya to help dispel rumors. This was years ago already, so where speakers were not integrated with drones, so they weren't using speaker drones, but specific project was to try and counter misinformation. You can Google it, Sentinel Project drones Turkana misinformation, and see how they've been using that. In terms of using the drones to counter misinformation, I think potentially, if done carefully and right with the appropriate guidelines and having all that be context specific, it could potentially work as an add-on. It's a great question that we haven't received before, so I'm excited to hear it. It could be complementary to other applications, especially I'm thinking now maybe in the context of refugee camp, if there are no, where we've had issues with misinformation, if connectivity is not available and there are no tethered drones and radios are not available, then potentially through broadcast drones, that may potentially add value. It's a great question. I'll keep thinking about it, and I'll ask around to see what others think of the application. And again, it really, the process we would take would be that same process I described with that decision tree, right? Is identify the problem owners and talk to them and figure out what they're already doing and go through that particular process. Another question we're seeing here is there's, that this person is guessing that organizations tend to jump on shiny solutions without necessarily doing great research. That's another statement. Would you say that the crisis is exacerbating this phenomenon, or on the contrary, is demonstrating that organizations are realizing these strategies often fail? That's a phenomenal question. I don't know. I guess it'll just be anecdotal. From my end, I can just say I expected more. I really expected more from organizations, companies, and others, and have been disappointed by just how many people are just drinking the Kool-Aid and promoting all kinds of nonsense in terms of applications. I just expected more. Maybe that's me being naive. And frankly, that's why we started this COVID series. I just got frustrated. I thought it was going to go away. I was like, oh, should we do a blog post? Should we do a webinar? And I was like, no, people are going to calm down. It's going to go away. And yet, still as of today, people are launching new projects using, fever detecting drones and disinfecting drones and so on. So I don't know. Those colleagues of mine with whom I've worked with in the humanitarian space over the past 10, 15 years are aghast. Many of them are saying, wow, the Haiti earthquake from 2010, obviously 10 years ago, looks like nobody's learned anything between the Haiti earthquake and the pandemic 10 years later. And so some of this is kind of frustrating, to say the least, and quite disappointing. So we're trying to do our best to encourage more critical thinking and to be a bit more evidence-based. So I'll just say it's 50-50. We're seeing equal amount of nonsense as equal amount of maybe rigorous thinking. Although, to be honest, when I say that out loud, it's probably 10% of critical thinking and 90% of non-critical thinking. Another question is that we're seeing the use of drones spraying chemicals not being effective because the effect of propellers in the downdraft. Interesting. So because of the significant downdraft, obviously caused by the propellers to keep the aircraft in the air, is maybe not having an optimal effect on the way that the chemicals are sprayed. maybe different nozzles might be more effective. I mean, good question. I'm not an expert on spraying. I've not done this. I could ask some of my colleagues at the Flying Labs who use spraying drones for agriculture to get a sense of how they optimize the spraying. But again, based on the Lancet study and other scientific research, just the spraying of these chemicals for COVID is a no-no. It's people are, scientists and so on are asking people to stop doing that. Got a couple more questions here, and thank you very much, by the way. These are great questions, so feel free to keep them coming. Question on AI and AI's ability to scan crowds and identify people at risk. The science has not yet learned how to do so with traditional measures. So, and the AI is not there yet. That's a good question. It depends on what exactly we're looking for in terms of what constitutes at risk. This other drone company is saying that it's looking at heartbeats. They can measure a person's heartbeat from 50 meters away using a drone and a sensor, can look for the discoloration under people's eyes. They claim to take that into account for their AI algorithms and so on. It's hard to believe, to be honest. I'm quite skeptical. I think it's going to be there's not enough training data to begin with. In order to be able to train these algorithms, you need training data. And how much imagery out there is available that you can use to actually train your algorithms? So I don't know. I think it's still an applied research project. And as if we do see some breakthroughs in that respect, it's going to really cause some serious concerns again on the privacy and data protection side. So what we are seeing is, for example, Peru Flying Labs is using AI in Lima when they're mapping areas of Lima with the authorities to automatically count the number of vehicles or automatically count the number of umbrellas that are used for these outdoor markets to try and get an index or proxy for how lockdowns are being respected over time and so on. So AI is being used in that case, right? But it's not being used in real time. So we'll have to see what happens there. But that's a great question. I'm seeing two other questions here. From a personal point of view, yeah, somebody's basically saying, from their point of view, it seems like a lot of these drone projects in response to COVID are less for providing public help and more for publicity. I wholeheartedly agree, and then some. My question is planning and proper implementation is a major part than just flying. You're completely right. What we often say when we train national disaster management organizations and international humanitarian organizations, including the Red Cross, the UN, and all the other big and small humanitarian organizations, we do professional trainings on the use of drones in disaster response, which is more focused on mapping. But what we always use is this diagram, a pie chart, and there's a sliver of the pie chart, maybe 5% of the pie chart, that corresponds to flying. So the pie chart is, where does the time go when you do disaster response and you deploy drones in humanitarian context? 5% of the time goes into flying, and 95% of the time goes into swearing, which basically means the flying is the easiest, shortest bit of a humanitarian drone mission. Getting the flight permissions, understanding what areas of interest to prioritize, how high to fly, what spatial resolution to capture, what kind of information products are required, doing media outreach, community engagement, strategic partnerships, you name it, right? And then the whole analysis, data processing, and even when you've produced your information products that you hand over to decision makers, that's not the end of it either, because many decision makers don't know how to interpret the data. So you have to think of more appropriate data visualization solutions. And then you actually need somebody who is going to be serve as a translator of sorts to really help inform the decisions that governments can make based on this data, right? So we also advocate for working with local think tanks and local media to provide them with the evidence that they can then lobby and advocate governments to take the right decisions based on this data. You're absolutely right. Flying is 5% of the solution, and that's it, not more. How well do drones cope in extreme weather? Great question, and that's largely a question of budget. You have, the more weatherproof your drones are, the more expensive they tend to be, the more sophisticated they tend to be, which does not mean it has to be a deal breaker, but that's basically the setup right now. You can have drones that can fly through relatively strong winds, relatively strong rains and storms, but they're going to be far more sophisticated, far more expensive. So that's really the trade-off. But those drones exist, and there are ways that you can use relatively more affordable drones and modify them to be a bit more weatherproof, but they're not going to necessarily be as good as those drones that are designed first and foremost to be fully weatherproof, or as much as possible. Okay, so a few more questions. To maximize the impact on logistics, we need to shift the discussion to the effect of drones on the whole medical supply network, from patient to pathology lab and pharmacy back to patient. 110% correct. Totally could not agree more. Again, having worked on with Flying Labs on a number of cargo drone projects in the Peruvian Amazon rainforest, in the mountains of the Dominican Republic, foothills of the Himalaya, in Nepal, in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and now in Cameroon, I completely agree with that. It has to be far more of a holistic approach, and then some. That's something we really go into more detail in our online training on the use of medical cargo drones in public health. It's one of the big points of emphasis that we make. This is great, by the way. I'm loving all these questions, so thank you. You're making my day here. Another question is about spraying using a DJI Agras. This colleague is noting that one of those spraying drones ended up being stuck in the wires of electricity lines in Lima. A company was using the drone to disinfect people, and now due to the accident, the government has banned the use of drones here in Peru until July. Wow, that I hadn't heard. Holy cow. Wow. Thank you for sharing. I will revert back to you all at Peru Flying Labs and get the latest on that. That is. So here you have an example of somebody using drone technology that has been proven to be disinfecting spraying, that has proven to have no positive impact and actually could have harmful impact on health and the environment, crash their drone, and now are preventing any type of drones, even legitimate, impactful uses of drones in Peru. So that's if that is all in fact the case, and that is, dear. Okay, a few more questions here as well. Tethered drones near fixed marketplaces fed with AI software help in social distancing, or can help in social distancing. Yeah, potentially. Again, I think there's so many different factors that go into determining whether that's can be impactful or cost effective and so on. I mean, the advantage, of course, with tethered drones, just like with a connectivity application, one of our partners who actually is a company, a young company that develops tethered drones for connectivity, their drones can stay up in the air for 6 weeks consecutively and can deal with rain, can deal with wind and so on. So there are definitely advantages. And we're seeing that being used in surveillance as well, right? It's called pervasive surveillance, which also, again, creates some, frankly, it's creepy and creates some concerns over privacy and so on, but potentially could help for distancing. Remains to be seen. I'd love to get more information on that. We're seeing two more questions here, one on drone swarms and one on looking at just the nature of the COVID crisis that requires new applications that for people to basically not have to touch each other. But more in general, so there's a question there in terms of drones and contactless deliveries. On the first question with swarms, I mean, we're seeing definitely in the entertainment space some very impressive applications. Just the other night in the US, I think in Pennsylvania, a drone swarming drone entertainment company did a whole night show specifically to thank medical workers, nurses, doctors for their heroic work in response to the COVID. So that was an interesting other application of drones to celebrate the heroes who are literally putting their lives at risk. From an operational perspective, in terms of public health and humanitarian, we did field test a swarming software for drones. It's been a couple of years now from a startup in the UK. We brought them out, did some field tests for a full day. The software was buggy. Again, this was 2 years ago and they were just a startup at the time. Not entirely sure what the software is right now. The challenge with this in any event is that you have to have the manufacturers on board. So the biggest players in the industry obviously are DJI, SenseFly, Parrot, Dell Air Tech, and so on. Unless they start building in swarming features within their mission planning software and so on, it's going to be hard to work around their proprietary technology. It's going to involve more hacking. But I should have probably led by saying that I'm not an expert on the latest in the use of swarming tech. I know a number of universities have done some impressive work with swarming technology, but again, it's all been in the lab and not outdoor and not in the wild. On the other, that second question, yeah, I think one of the reasons why delivery drones are getting so much traction right now, whether or not they're all being that impactful remains to be seen, or we're doing our best to document that. But yeah, the ability to basically deliver at a distance without necessarily having somebody come into proximity with another person certainly is one of the compelling reasons why one would want to explore the use of delivery drones. I think it's a very compelling application. We weren't necessarily thinking about this before the pandemic, but obviously it becomes another selling point, I guess, for the use of delivery drones. What's interesting is in Florida, one company is providing, I think, delivering prescription medication to I think an elderly community in Florida. But what the delivery is just like 1.5 miles by drone, and then the drone lands and the medication gets put on a truck, and then the truck does the door-to-door deliveries, if you'd like. So I don't have any more details on that, but you'll see we've referenced it in that blog post on the use of cargo drones in response to COVID. All right, staying strong here. The question or comment here about, my interpretation of this comment is, there are steps we could possibly take to make people more receptive to the use of drones, to make drones look or be perceived as less threatening and actually more genuinely helping people. And I think that that I'm obviously all for that. That's why in the context of the broadcasting drones, one of the things we say in our study is to at least use that as an opportunity to provide it to be used as an information service. Use the broadcasting drones to provide a service, to provide news you can use, right? To local communities, not just orders, do this, do that, do this, but become valuable to the community, give something back, offer something, and then ask in return for behavior change. I mean, that's classic best practice lessons learned from 20, 30 years of disaster response. None of that is new. It's just that, startups, drone companies, and so on, they don't have that experience, and you can't necessarily fault them for not having that experience. It's just that I think for some of us who've been involved in in the humanitarian space and public health for decades, sometimes kind of feel like ripping our hair out. Again, that was one of the reasons why we launched the humanitarian UAV drone code of conduct back in 2014, because we were just seeing, mistakes happening over and over again. Because now drone pilots started becoming part of disaster response, but had never really had any experience in disaster response. We have one last question, I guess, and then we'll wrap it up. When movement restrictions are lifted, sorry, this is an invitation to give a talk in the UK. That's very, very kind of you. I would welcome the opportunity when the time is right. And that looks like it's most of the questions. One favor, if I may ask, is please help us get the word out on what seems to be working and what is potentially the opposite of working, and help us promote that decision tree that you saw. It's a simple diagram. Post it on social media. You don't even have to give us credit. That's not the point here. Just get it out there to folks who you think might be able to learn something and might actually help do more positive impact. Please also share the humanitarian drone code of conduct, uavcode.org. Share that widely. It's there for a reason. It's based on a lot of hard lessons, frustrating, painful lessons. So if we can prevent others from making the same mistakes we made 6 years ago, that will be a huge win. I think we all have a role to try and promote, the responsible, ethical, effective application of humanitarian technology, broadly speaking, throughout this pandemic and beyond. And all of you are connected to networks, companies, organizations, media. Your help in just disseminating this would be so valued and very much welcomed. I think and of course your feedback. Let us know what we're missing in these studies. Like I said, we're updating them on a regular basis. What we're getting wrong, please let us know how we can also serve the broader community better as well. So on that note, you've been phenomenal. Thank you so much for this, all these questions, for staying on to almost an hour and a half of your time. Really, really appreciate it. Please stay well, be healthy, and let's remember the bigger picture here in helping others who are not necessarily in as good a places as we are right now. So thanks again. We will share this recording of the webinar on our blog as well. You'll find that in the next 24 hours, and feel free to help us share that widely as well. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your week. Be safe, be well, and have a good weekend.